Hello, thank you for joining me at Bert's Books. This time I'm going to be looking at rather a dismal item, in my opinion. The novelisation of the 1978 film treatment of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, until only a few years ago, I had no idea that this existed. I had no idea it had happened. I'm old enough to remember Saturday Night Fever being huge. That was a huge success, both as a film and as a Bee Gees album. I remember the Bee Gees at the end of 1978, again a huge success with the Spirits Having Flown album and the Tragedy single, which, as far as I recall, was #1 for weeks and weeks. This might have been early 1979 actually, but I remember nothing in between. I have no recollection of this mess of a film and the soundtrack album that went along with it, and even a novelisation. So this whole enterprise was an undertaking of the Robert Stigwood organisation, who by the time of this were flush with the success of I think Grease, Saturday Night Fever, and I don't know how much of a commercial success Tommy was off the top of my head, but you know, certainly a landmark musical cinema. This, however, might have been a bit of a case of hubris, and may have been a case of over-ambition would describe it, or running a ill-conceived idea. Really should have been smothered at birth. If you're not familiar with this, you may have guessed that this whole undertaking was an attempt to string together a particularly flimsy narrative from the titles of various Beatles songs, most notably of course the Sgt. Pepper's album, but I think they've thrown others in there, Abbey Road possibly. Now, I'm not particularly precious about the music of the Beatles myself. I'm not one of those people who's going to be going, oh, you shouldn't touch that. However, I don't know why parties involved felt that the music of the Beatles deserved this. Now, the involvement of any actual member of the Beatles, they're conspicuous by their absence from this enterprise. George Martin is one of the guilty parties. He was behind stringing together the soundtrack, which was performed, as indeed the thing was acted, by the Bee Gees and also Peter Frampton in a lead role. How toothy is that? The seeds of this lay in a Broadway production, like a stage theatre rendering of this idea, but the Stigwood organisation took this on as a film project, and what a dog it turned out to be. I've sat through the film, most of it. It's on YouTube if you have the stomach for it. But it's not one of those things, it's not like one of those classic bad films where there's some redeeming naffness or kitschness, or it's just bad. There's nothing to recommend it. There's not even as a joke. My takeaway from watching the film, I'm just astonished, A, that this idea wasn't just throttled at birth, B, that they went through with this. At no stage, apparently, was someone sober enough to step back and go, this is an awful idea, let's stop. This went straight through from its conception right through to completion, to a soundtrack album, to a film in the cinemas, to a spin-off fucking novelisation. Even, it talks on the back of another spin-off. I don't know if this happened. The official Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band scrapbook, now in bookstores everywhere. Presumably that exists. A friend of mine suggested that the reason I don't remember it is that it died a death super quickly. He told me that he remembers the album being in our hometown's bargain bins within weeks. Now, there was eventually Bee Gees backlash. That came later. In 1978, not even this could seemingly derail them, but I can't help thinking it must have in the background been a contributory factor. Now, when I picked this up, I think I had the unrealistic hope that, I thought that maybe in the hands of a more aware or maybe a mischievous author could have had a little bit of fun with this and maybe sort of had a sly dig at the ridiculousness of what it was representing. However, Henry Edwards, the author of this, was also the author of the film's script, so we're shit out of luck there. So how on earth have they made a connected narrative out of Sgt. Pepper's? Well, it starts off Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, these old geezers from the wholesome little town of Heartland. Get to fuck. I mean, it's almost like they stop the First World War through the joyousness of their music. Now, the whole writing style with this, possibly even worse than the film, is one of just, it's just infantile. It's as if this book is written for 6-year-olds, which, you know, when you're talking about this twee little band in this kind of, actually this town Heartland, it sounds really strange because they emphasise the wholesomeness of this place to a degree that is just so exaggerated. It's almost like something you'd get in a David Lynch film or something like that. So cutesy and icky. As if you crossed Walton's Mountain with that place that Pee Wee Herman supposedly lives in. But that's immediately doing a disservice to those fictional places which have a lot more to be said for them than fucking Heartland. So anyway, our boys in the Lonely Hearts Club Band, they go back to Heartland, but by this time Sgt. Pepper and his lads are getting a bit old. I think he pegs out mid-concert, but he's left in his will this stipulation that certain of the boys from the town, namely the Henderson brothers, 3 of them, i.e. the Bee Gees, along with Billy Shears, Peter Frampton in the film, are to take on the mantle of being the new Lonely Hearts Club Band and to bring joy, blah 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 with it. Meanwhile, Sgt. Pepper, the town choose to represent him physically by rendering him as a weathercock and sticking him up on the town hall. And these fabled instruments of theirs, which supposedly have these mystical powers to bring peace and joy and all the rest of it, they are enshrined in a not terribly secure museum. You know, the thing is that they have these instruments have to stay in Heartland in order to preserve the super strength wholesomeness of this place. Now, as well as being very infantile, there's also a tone of judginess to this book. In other words, if you're not one of these nice wholesome people, then you're a loser. You're one of those bad people. It's all absolutes, there's no middle ground. Now there's one cuckoo in the nest, Billy's brother, Dougie, as played by Paul Nicholas, an actor you couldn't keep away from something like this. Paul Nicholas, I mean, he's in some decent stuff. He does a great job in Tommy. He's a permanent presence in these kind of musical film productions. The Bee Gees as actors, I don't think it's ever been a thing since. You know, I have great regard for the Bee Gees as a pop band, but as actors, there are names in this that are disappointing. You think some of the people involved in this would have known better. For instance, amongst the actors, and you know, normally I'd say it would be a good sign. If you have Donald Pleasance in your film, you know, he would normally, even if it wasn't that great a film, Pleasance would in some way elevate it. Similarly, Frankie Howard is in this. Again, you know, you'd think usually an actor, you know, a comedian of his calibre would bring things up. Now, the combination of them both would lead you to think that we're in for some very rare and unusual comedy-horror hybrid here. Well, it's certainly that, but I'm not saying that in a good way. Now, other names in here. Alice Cooper is in this. Aerosmith. Billy Preston. What I find hardest to swallow is that Earth, Wind and Fire got involved in this. The thing is, Earth, Wind and Fire have been involved in a film before, and that film is one of the most revolutionary pieces of cinema. It's the other side of the galaxy from this. It's a film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song by Melvin Van Peebles, and it is the most revolutionary piece of cinema. And Earth, Wind and Fire score this righteous, stick it to the man soundtrack. I think this film was maybe 1971. Within a few short years, they're reduced to this shit. So anyway, that's diverted me from what drivel constitutes the plot in this. The new Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band are of course an instant sensation. The townspeople of fucking Heartland. The place consists of pensioners who are kind of very patronisingly portrayed as these sweet old things, and then there's the kids, or as they're described, constantly described in this, as the brashy boys and the silly girls. And the brashy boys and the silly girls are of course all bowled over by the instant musical genius of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But it's not long until their reputation spreads and people from the big bad city, Los Angeles, the record company Big Deal Records in Los Angeles, get wind that there's this sensational new group and dispatch a message that they've got to hear these boys. With Dougie inadvisedly installed in some sort of managerial role, they are instantly seduced by the promise of fame from this evil record company. Now they talk about judgmentalism in this, the way people are portrayed in LA. It's like fucking Gomorrah, and it strikes me as rather rich that this is the Robert Stigwood organisation, you know, talking as if this is nothing to do with them, that there's some big kind of money orientated cynical record company in the big town. Oh, how awful. In fact, the only fragment of wit or self-awareness within this is the portrayal of Big Deal Records, their logo. I think it's a pig with kind of dollar signs in its eyes or something, or it's sitting on some dollars. That's the only glimmer within this that you get. So they're seduced off to LA with, you know, with Dougie egging them along. Of course they travel by fucking balloon for part of it, because you've got to be as twee as you bloody can in this thing. And, you know, LA and everyone who lives there and everyone who works there is presented as this kind of soulless whore, right? And, you know, which, you know, given that this book has started off, the whole tone it's adopted is this relentlessly infantile, you know, the children's book. It's like a kid wrote it, but suddenly you're in Sodom. Instantly this group are mobbed by groupies and there's heaving breasts pressed against the car window. It's so fucking jarring considering it's written like a children's book. And all along the way, you know, there's various Beatles lyrics crowbarred in, you know, where they seem to be appropriate to the plot. While the whores and sluts of LA and the record company are eyeing up the band around the swimming pool, and there's a rendition of I Want You, that kind of thing. So, you know, interspersed throughout this, you'll get various Beatles lyrics. Meanwhile, back in Heartland, in the boy's absence, mean Mr. Mustard shows up. Now this is the Frankie Howard character. Now mean Mr. Mustard, he's another of these losers. He's this kind of roving, ageing, jealous pervert who travels around like in his own version of the Mystery Machine with these kind of sex robots. So Mr. Mustard, of course, gets a bonk on for Billy's love interest. She goes by the name, you may have guessed by now, Strawberry Fields. So Mr. Mustard and his pervert robots kind of set about, when they're not stalking her, they're kind of lowering the tone of the town. Again, this judgmental thing comes in. Now the boys have left, Mr. Mustard, he twigs, I think, his kind of weird voyeur computer instructs him. So he gets the idea that he's going to, because these instruments in the museum have some power that he can misuse, that he's going to steal these instruments, so which actually doesn't turn out that hard to do. Anyway, over in LA, Billy, far from having Strawberry Fields at the front of his mind, he's busily getting seduced by number one of the hoary entourage of this record company, Lucy, who's the singer with the Diamonds. I think you can see where that one's going to go as well. So, you know, the boys fall victim to Big Deal Records and LA's temptations. Remarkably easy for wholesome boys from Heartland. Anyway, in the meantime, Heartland, of course, is going to the dogs because, you know, bad people, those bad other places have moved in, and oh no, because all the good vibe has gone, the wholesomeness has been compromised. So, word of this gets about, and so the town's mayor, Mr. Kite, as played by George Burns, this is his hour of need. Benefit gig for Heartland is called for, and for this event the boys are called back from LA. Strawberry Fields makes that journey and runs the gauntlet of Sin Alley to reconnect with Billy, and so they travel from Sin City back to Heartland to perform this benefit gig, at which they realise that the instruments have been stolen, so they set about trying to recover them. They do this by interrogating Mean Mr. Mustard's sex robots, who are so smitten with the relative prettiness of the boys that one of them caves in immediately. One of these instruments will now be in the care of Dr. Maxwell Edison, as played by Steve Martin, a doctor in the Harold Shipman mode who's rather keen on murdering his patients, now being in possession of this silver hammer. Of course they jam another song in here. Anyway, he's overpowered after a song and dance routine. The instrument is retrieved, and the next instrument to recover is in the hands of this kind of cult leader, as played by Alice Cooper. There's also some sort of set to with the other bad guys, as played by Aerosmith, the future villain band, who I think Billy has to wrest Strawberry Fields from the advances of a leering Steven Tyler. But in the fracas that ensues, Strawberry Fields is killed. Strawberry Fields dies. Oh no. But you know, this is okay because they get her body back to Heartland, and at this point Sergeant Pepper, this kind of miraculous transmutation occurs with the weathercock becoming flesh again, although this time Sergeant Pepper returns to the earthly plane in the form of Billy Preston, who performs a version of Get Back while descending magically from the town hall tower, zapping people with his fingers. He zaps Strawberry Fields, thus returning her to life. Everything's hunky-dory again. So that's it, you know, a rather facile resolution to a deeply stupid plot. Now, you know, I suspect this thing will have its hardcore of fans out there, but, you know, if you feel the need to have a few friends round, if you're allowed to at this point, get some drinks in and have a viewing of Sergeant Pepper's, expecting those kind of bad film giggles that you might get from The Room, The Apple, or something like that. Make sure you have a backup film to watch if you're going to try it. You don't need this book. I don't need this book. I don't want this shit in my house. It's awful. Maybe I will give this away as a prize. If I get a 666th subscriber, maybe I will send them this as a prize, on the condition they then have to film themselves and put it up on YouTube. They have to read out the section at the end of the book. Bear in mind this is a short book. It's a 200-page book, and 5 pages at the end is the author just listing bands. Did they just need to fill space, or did they think this was an idea? I don't know. Sergeant Pepper smiles. There is a crash of thunder. Be the stars of your dreams, says Sergeant Pepper. And suddenly they are, in their imaginations. They are all the stars who have made music great. And off it goes. Stars like Stevie Wonder, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, Aretha Franklin, Elton John, David Bowie, Diana Ross, the Bay City Rollers, fuck knows what. It's just pages and pages of, oh yeah, them. It's astonishing. It's so bad. Should you feel the need after all this to play an unnecessarily cruel prank on a young relative, why not try this? Block out George Burns as I've done here. Show your children this cover illustration. Try to convince them that this was the Beatles.
Hit the train!